Chapter 21. That winter, I was obliged to return home. A letter arrived from my mother explaining that my father's illness had taken a turn for the worse. Although there was no immediate cause of concern, she wrote, considering his age, she felt I should arrange to come back if possible. My father had long suffered from a kidney ailment, and as is often the case with men of middle age and older, his illness was chronic. But he and the rest of the family believed that his condition would remain stable as long as he was careful. Indeed, he boasted to visitors that it was entirely due to his rigorous care of his health that he had managed to live so long. My mother told me, however, that when he was out in the garden, he had suddenly felt dizzy and fainted. The family at first mistook it for a slight stroke and treated him accordingly. Only later had the doctor concluded that the problem was related to his kidney disease. The winter vacation would soon begin, and feeling that I could safely wait out the term, I let the matter slide from one day to the next. But as the days passed, images of my bedridden father and my anxious mother kept rising from before my eyes, provoking such an ache in my heart that finally I decided I must go home. To avoid having to wait while the money was sent from home, I went to visit Sensei to borrow the amount from my fare. Besides, I wanted to bid him farewell. Sensei was suffering from a slight cold. He did not feel inclined to come to the living room, so he asked me into his study. Soft sunlight, of a kind rarely seen in winter, was shining through the study's glass door onto the cloth draped over his desk. In this sunny room, Sensei had set a metal basin containing water over the coals of a brazier so that by inhaling the steam he could soothe his lungs. Serious illness doesn't bother me, but I do had these petty colds, he remarked with a wry smile. Sensei had never had a real illness of any sort, so I found this amusing. I can put up with a cold, I said, but I would not want anything worse. Surely it would be the same, Sensei. Just try getting really ill and you will soon see. You think so? If I were to actually get sick, I would prefer it to be fatal. I paid this remark no particular attention, but instead proceeded to tell him about my mother's letter and asked for a loan. I'm sorry to hear that, he said. I have enough on hand to cover the amount, I think, so you must take it here and now. He called his wife and asked her to bring the money. She produced it from the drawer of some cupboard in the far room and presented it to me, placed formally on a sheet of white paper. This must be very worrying for you, she said. Has it happened before? Sensei inquired. The letter didn't say. Is it likely to continue? Yes. This was how I first learned that his wife's mother had died of the same illness. It's not an easy illness, I ventured. Indeed not. I wish I could offer myself in his place. Does he feel any nausea? I don't know. The letter didn't mention it, so I guess that's not a real problem. If he is not nauseous, then things are still all right, said Sensei's wife. That evening, I left Tokyo by train. Chapter 22. My father's illness was not as serious as I had feared. When I arrived, he was sitting up cross-legged in bed. I'm staying put here just to please everyone, since they worry about me, he said. I could perfectly well get up. Nevertheless, the next day he had my mother put away his bedding and refused to listen to her protest. Your father seems to have suddenly got his strength back now that you have come home, she remarked to me as she reluctantly folded the silk quilt. And from what I could observe, he was not simply putting on a brave face. My elder brother had a job in distant Kyushu and could not easily get away to visit his parents in any situation short of a real emergency. My sister had married someone in another part of the country, so could not be summoned home on short notice either. Of the three children, I was the one most easily called on, being still a student. The fact that I had followed my mother's wishes and left my studies early to come home pleased my father greatly. It's a shame you have had to leave classes early for such a trivial illness, he said. Your mother should not go exaggerating things in letters like that. This bravado was not confined to words, for there he was, with his sickbed folded away, behaving as if his health were back to normal. Don't be too rash, or you will have a relapse, I warned him, but he treated this with happy disregard. Come on now, I'm fine. All I have to do is take the usual care. And he appeared to be fine. He came and went around the house without becoming breathless or feeling dizzy. True, his color was awful, but this symptom was nothing new, so we paid it little attention. I wrote to Sensei, thanking him for his kind loan and promising to call in and repay him when I returned to Tokyo in January. I went on to report that my father's illness was less critical than feared, that we had no immediate cause for concern, and that he had neither dizziness nor nausea. I ended by briefly asking after Sensei's call, which was not something that I took very seriously. I wrote this letter without any expectation that Sensei would reply. Then I told my parents about him, and as I spoke, the image of Sensei's distant study hovered before me. Why not take some of our dried mushrooms to him when you go back? Fine, but I'm not sure Sensei eats such things actually. They are not first red ones, but I don't imagine anyone would dislike them. It felt somehow odd to associate Sensei with dried mushrooms. When a reply came from him, I was quite surprised, particularly because it seemed written for no special reason. I decided that he had written back out of sheer kindness. That idea made his straightforward letter delight me. Besides, it was the first letter I had ever received from him. Although one might naturally have thought that we corresponded from time to time, in fact we never had. I received only 2 letters from Sensei before his death. The first was this simple reply. The second was an extremely long letter that he wrote for me shortly before he died. My father's illness prevented him from being very active. Even once he was up and about, and he seldom went outdoors. One unusually balmy day, when he did venture out into the garden, I accompanied him just as a precaution. I offered my shoulder for him to lean on, but he brushed it off with a laugh. Chapter 23. To keep my father from boredom, I frequently partnered him in a game of shogi. Being lazy, we could not be bothered to set up a special board, but sat as usual around the warm kotatsu, placing the board between us on the low table so that between moves we could keep our hands tucked under the rug. Sometimes one of us would lose a piece and neither would notice until the next game. Once, to great hilarity, my mother had to use the fire tongs to retrieve a lost piece from the brazier's ashes. A go board is too high, my father remarked, and it has those legs, so you can't put it on the table and play in comfort around the kotatsu the way you can with shogi. This is a fine game for the indolent. How about another round, eh? He would always suggest another round whenever he had just won. Mind you, he would say the same thing if he had just lost. In a word, he simply enjoyed sitting around the kotatsu playing shogi regardless of the outcome. At first, I found this rare taste of the pleasures of the retired quite beguiling, but my youthful energies soon began to fret at such bland stimulation. From time to time, I would yawn and stretch up my arms, waving aloft some piece I happened to be holding. Whenever I thought about Tokyo, I felt the blood that pumped strongly through my heart pulsing to a rhythm that cried, "Action, action!" Strangely, through some subtle mechanism of the mind, this inner pulse seemed to be empowered by Sensei. In my heart, I experimentally compared the two men, my father and Sensei. Both were quiet, retiring people who, as far as the world at large was concerned, could just as well be dead. Neither received the slightest recognition, yet playing partner to my shogi-loving father and sharing his simple enjoyments gave me no satisfaction, while Sensei, to whom I had never gone for mere amusement, had influenced my mind far more deeply than would any idle entertainment. My mind sounds too cool and detached. Let me rather say my breast. It would have felt no exaggeration to say that Sensei's strength seemed to have entered my body and my very blood flowed with his life force. When I pondered the fact that my father was my real father, whereas Sensei was quite unrelated to me, I felt as astonished as if I had come upon a new and important truth. As tedium settled over me, my parents' initial delight in me as some rare and precious creature was also fading, and they began to take my presence for granted. I suppose everyone experiences this shift when they return home for a vacation. For the first week or so, you are first over and treated as honored guest. Then the family's enthusiasm wanes, and finally you are treated quite offhandedly, as if they don't really care whether you are there or not. The second phase now inevitably set in. These days, furthermore, each time I came home from the city, I brought a new aspect of myself that was strange and incomprehensible to my parents. It was an element that was fundamentally out of harmony with both of them, rather, as if to make a historical analogy. I had introduced into a traditional Confucian household the disturbing aura of forbidden Christianity. Of course, I did my best to hide it, but it was part of me, and try as I might to keep it to myself. They sooner or later noticed. Thus, I grew bored and disillusioned with home life, and longed to go back to Tokyo as soon as possible. Fortunately, my father's condition gave no sign of deteriorating further, although the state of his health continued to be fragile. Just to be sure, we called in a highly reputable doctor from some distance away, but his careful examination revealed no new problems. I decided to leave a little before the end of the winter vacation, but when I announced this decision, human feelings being the perverse things they are, both parents were against it. "You're going back already? It's very soon, isn't it?" said my mother. My father joined in. "You could easily stay another 4 or 5 days, surely," but I held to my original plan. Chapter 25. By the time I returned to Tokyo, the New Year decorations had disappeared from house fronts. In the city, no sign remained of the recent New Year festivities. The streets were given over to a chill, wintry wind. I took the first opportunity to visit Sensei and return the money I had borrowed. I also brought along the mushrooms that my mother had pressed on me. Laying them before Sensei's wife, I hastened to explain that my mother had suggested the gift. The mushrooms were carefully packed inside a new cake box. Sensei's wife thanked me politely. When she rose to leave the room, she picked up the box, then feeling its lightness, asked in surprise what the cakes were. It was typical of the wonderfully childlike frankness she could display once she got to know someone well. Both of them questioned me at length and with great concern about my father's illness. "Well, it seems from what you say of his condition that there's no cause for immediate alarm," Sensei said. "But being the illness it is, he will need to look after himself very carefully." I could see that he knew a great deal more than I did about kidney disease. It's typical of that illness that the patient feels quite well and unaware of the disease. I knew a military officer who was killed by it. He simply died overnight, quite astonishing. His death was so sudden that his own wife hadn't even realized he was ill. He just woke her in the night saying he felt bad, and the next morning he was dead. It happened so swiftly that she said she had assumed he was sleeping. The optimism I had been inclined to feel shifted to sudden anxiety. I wonder if that's what will happen to my dad. There's no saying it won't. What does the doctor say? He says there's no hope of curing it, but he also assured us there's no need to worry for the present. Well then, that's fine, if that's what the doctor says. The man I just told you about wasn't ever he was ill, and besides, he was quite a rough army fellow, not the sort to notice things. I felt somewhat comforted. Seeing this change in me, Sensei added, "But sick or well, humans are fragile creatures, you know. There's no anticipating how and when they might die, or for what reason." "That's how you feel yourself, is it, Sensei?" I'm in fine health, but yes, even I think this from time to time." A suggestion of a smile played on his lips. "You often hear of people kneeling over and dying, don't you? Of natural causes, and then other people die suddenly from some unnatural act of violence." "What's an unnatural act of violence?" "Well, I don't know. People who commit suicide use unnatural violence in themselves, don't they? People who are murdered also die from unnatural violence." I wasn't thinking of murder, but now that you mention it, that's true, of course. So the conversation ended that day. Even later, after I returned home, my father's illness did not worry me unduly. Nor did Sensei's talk of natural and unnatural deaths leave more than a passing, vague impression on my mind. I was preoccupied with another matter, for I finally had to set to and write the graduation thesis that I had tried so many times to come to grips with before. Chapter 25. If I were to graduate this June as expected, I had to finish the thesis in the required form by the end of April. But when I counted off the remaining days on my fingers, my heart began to fail me. The other students had all been visibly busy for some time, gathering material and writing notes, while I alone had done absolutely nothing toward the paper. I had put it off with the intention of throwing myself into the task after the new year, and in this spirit I now set about it. But in no time I ground to a halt. The abstract idea of a grand theme was outlined in my mind, and the framework of the discussion felt more or less in place. But now I sat held in hands, despairing. So I set about reducing my theme to something more manageable. Finally, I decided to bypass the trouble of systematically setting down my own ideas. Instead, I would simply present material from various books on the subject and add a suitable conclusion. The topic I had chosen was closely related to Sensei's field of expertise, and when I ventured to ask his opinion about it, he had approved. In my present state of confusion, therefore, I naturally took myself straight off to visit Sensei and ask him to recommend some books. He willingly told me all he knew and even offered to lend me 2 or 3 books, but he had absolutely no move to take on the task of actually advising me. I don't read much these days, so I don't know what's new in the field. You should ask your professors. I recalled then that his wife had said that he had once been a great reader, but for some reason his interest had waned considerably. My thesis momentarily forgotten, I spontaneously asked, "Why aren't you as interested in books as you used to be, Sensei?" "There's no particular reason. I suppose it's because I believe you don't really become a finer person just by reading lots of books. And also, what else?" "Not else really. You see, in the old days, I used to feel uncomfortable and ashamed whenever someone asked me a question I couldn't answer. So when my ignorance was exposed in public somehow, these days, though I have come to feel that there's nothing particularly shameful about not knowing. So I don't any longer have the urge to push myself to read. I have grown old, in a word." Sensei spoke quite serenely. His words held no hint of the bitterness of someone who has turned his back on the world, so they failed to strike me as they might have. I went home feeling that, although he did not seem old to me, his philosophy was not very impressive. From then on, I spent my days sweating over my thesis like one possessed, my eyes bloodshot with effort and fatigue. I asked friends who had graduated a year ahead of me how they had fared in this situation. One told me how on the final day of submission he had hired a rickshaw and rushed his thesis to the university office, barely managing to get it there before the deadline. Another said he had taken it in 15 minutes past the 5 o'clock cut-off time and almost been rejected, but the department head had kindly intervened and allowed it to get through. These tales made me feel both nervous and encouraged. Every day at my desk, I pushed myself to the limits of my energy. When I wasn't seated at the desk, I was in the gloomy library scanning its high shelves. My eyes foraged greedily among the gold-printed titles on the book's spines, like a collector avidly searching through antiques. The plum trees bloomed and the cold winter wind shifted to the south. Sometime later came the first rumors of cherry blossoms. Still I plowed doggedly ahead, like a blinkered workhorse, flogged mercilessly on by my thesis. Not until late April, when at last I had completed the writing, did I cross the threshold of Sensei's house once more. Chapter 26. In the first days of summer, when the boughs of the late flowering double cherries were misted with a forced unfurling of green leaf, I finally achieved my freedom. Like a bird released from its cage, I spread my wings wide in delight and let my gaze roam over the world before me. I immediately went to visit Sensei. Along the way, my eyes drank in the vivid sight of a citrus hedge, its white buds bursting forth from the blackened branches, and a pomegranate tree, the glistening yellowish leaves sprouting from its withered trunk and glowing softly in the sunlight. It was as if I were seeing such things for the first time. When he saw my happy face, Sensei said, "So you have finished the thesis, have you? Well done." "Thanks to you," I replied. "I have finally made it. There's nothing left to do." Indeed, I had the delightful feeling just then that I had completed all the work I had to do in life and could proceed to enjoy myself to my heart's content. I was well satisfied with the paper I had written and confident of its worth. I chattered happily on to Sensei about it. As usual, Sensei listened with the occasional interjection of "I see" or "Is that so?" but made no further response. This lack of enthusiasm left me not so much dissatisfied as somehow deflated, but I was so full of energy that I attempted a counterattack. I invited him to come out with me into the world that was everywhere bursting into fresh green leaf. "Let's go for a walk somewhere, Sensei. It's wonderful out there." "Where to?" I did not care where. All I wanted was to take him out beyond the city limits. An hour later, we had indeed left the city behind us and were walking aimlessly through a quiet neighborhood that was something between village and town. I plucked a soft young leaf from a citrus hedge, cupped it between my palms and made it whistle as one does with a grass blade. I was good at this, having picked it up by imitating a friend of mine from Kagoshima. I gaily played as I strolled along, while Sensei walked beside me, ignoring me, face averted. At length, the little path opened out at a point below a large house shrouded by the fresh young leaves of an overgrown garden. We quickly realized that this was no private dwelling. The sign attached to the front gate bore the name of a plant nursery. Gazing at the gently sloping path, Sensei suggested we go in for a look. Yes, I agreed. It's a nurseryman's plantation, isn't it? Rounding a bend in the path, we came upon the house on our left. The sliding doors were all wide open, and there was no sign of life in the empty interior. The only movement was of the goldfish that swam about in a large tub that stood by the eave. All's quiet, isn't it? Do you think anyone would mind if we went further? I don't think it would matter. On through the garden we went, still seeing no sign of anyone. Azaleas bloomed all around us like flames. Sensei pointed to a tall bush of orange azaleas. This one would be the sort they call Kirishima. A plantation of peonies extended a good 30 yards across, but the season was too early for flowers. Sensei stretched himself out on an old bench by the peony bed, while I sat at the end of the bench smoking a cigarette. He lay there looking at the brilliantly clear blue sky. I was entranced by all the young leaves that surrounded me. Looking carefully, I discovered that the color of each was subtly different. Even on a single maple tree, no branch held two leaves of exactly the same hue. A passing breeze lifted Sensei's head from where he had hung it on the tip of a slender little cedar sapling and tossed it to the ground. Chapter 27. I immediately retrieved the head. It fell off Sensei, I said, flicking off the red grains of earth that clung here and there. Thank you. He half raised himself to take it. Then, still propped there, he asked me something odd. Forgive the sudden question, but is your family reasonably well off? Not particularly, no. So how well off are you, if you will excuse my asking? Well, we own a bit of forested land and a few rice fields, but there's very little money, I think. It was the first time Sensei had directly asked me about my family's financial situation. I, in turn, had never inquired about his circumstances. When I first met him, I had wondered how he could spend his days without having to work, and the question had remained with me ever since. I had kept it to myself, however, believing it would be discourteous to ask outright. As I sat here now, my weary eyes steeping in the balm of the fresh spring leaves, the question naturally occurred to me again. What about you, Sensei? How well off are you? Do I look rich to you? In fact, Sensei generally dressed quite frugally. The house was far from big and he only had one maid. Nevertheless, even an outsider like myself could see that he led a fairly affluent life. Although his lifestyle could hardly be termed luxurious, there was no sense of pinched frugality or straitened circumstances. Yes, you do, I replied. Well, I have a certain amount of money, but I am far from wealthy. If I were, I would build a larger house. Sensei had by now sat up and was cross-legged on the bench. He traced a circle on the ground with the tip of his bamboo cane. Once it was complete, he jabbed his cane upright into the earth. I used to be wealthy, in fact. He seemed to be speaking half to himself. I missed my chance to come back with another question and was reduced to silence. I used to be wealthy, he said again, now addressing me when he looked at me and smiled. I continued to make no reply. In fact, I did not have the wit to know how to respond. Sensei then changed the subject. How has your father been recently? I had heard nothing of my father's illness since the new year. The simple letter that arrived each month with my allowance was written in his hand as usual, but he made almost no mention of how he was feeling. His handwriting, moreover, was firm. The brushstrokes gave no hint of the tremors that affect those with his disease. No one said anything, so I guess he's fine again. That would be a good thing. Still, you have to remember what that illness is like. Yes, I guess he won't really recover, but he'll stay as he is for a while yet, I think. There's been no word about it. Is that so? I took his inquiries about my family's wealth and my father's illness at face value, as no more than an impulse of the moment. But behind his words loomed a larger issue that connected the two topics. I had no way of realizing it, however, since I lacked the experiences that Sensei had been through. Chapter 28. It's none of my business, of course, but in my opinion, if there's anything to inherit, you should make sure the matter's completely attended to before it's too late. Why not arrange things with your father now, while he's still well? When the worst happens, you know it's inheritance that causes the biggest problems. Yes. I paid no particular attention to his words. I believed that the others in our family, my parents included, were as little concerned about this issue as I was. Moreover, Sensei's uncharacteristic pragmatism somewhat startled me. My natural respect for an elder, however, made me hold my tongue. Please forgive me if my anticipating your father's death like this has offended you. But it's in the nature of things for people to die, you know. There's no knowing when even the healthiest of us will die. Sensei's tone held an unusual bitterness. It doesn't upset me in the slightest, I assured him. How many brothers and sisters do you say you had? He asked. He then inquired about the number of people in the family, what relatives I had, and details of my aunts and uncles. Are they all good people? I don't think there's anyone you would call bad. They are country people, for the most part. Why shouldn't country people be bad? This interrogation was becoming disconcerting, but Sensei did not even give me time to consider my answer. Country people are actually worse, if anything, than city folk, he went on. Another thing, you said just now that you didn't think there was anyone among your relatives you'd call bad. But do you imagine there's a certain type of person in the world who conforms to the idea of a bad person? You'll never find someone who fits that mold neatly, you know. On the whole, all people are good, or at least they're normal. The frightening thing is that they can suddenly turn bad when it comes to the crunch. That's why you have to be careful. Sensei was in full flow. I was about to interrupt him when a dog suddenly barked behind us. We both turned in surprise. Our bench stood at the front corner of a bed of cedar seedlings. To one side of it, a wide stand of thick dwarf bamboo stretched back, hiding the ground. In its midst, we could make out the back and furiously barking head of a dog. As we stared, a child of about 10 came running over and set about scolding the animal. He then came over to where we sat and bowed to Sensei, without removing his black skull cap. There was no one in the house when you came in, sir? He asked. No one. But my mom and sister were in the kitchen. Oh, were they? I see. Yeah, you should have said hello and come on in, sir. Sensei smiled wearily. He took out his purse and put a 5-cent coin into the lad's hand. Tell your mother, please, that we would like to take a rest here for a little. The boy nodded, his eyes twinkling with a knowing grin. I am leading the spy patrol in our game, see, he explained, and ran off down the hill through the azaleas. The dog raced after him, tail aloft. And sure enough, a couple more children of about the same age soon came running past in the same direction as our spy patroller. Chapter 29. Owing to the interruption, my conversation with Sensei never reached its proper conclusion, so I failed to discover what he was driving at. In those days, though, I felt none of his concerns about property and inheritance and so on. Both by nature and by circumstance, I was not inclined to bother my head over profit and gain. In retrospect, I realized that the whole question of money was still distant for me. I had never had to earn my own living, let alone personally confront the situation Sensei spoke of. But Sensei had said one thing that I wanted to get to the bottom of, his statement that when it comes to the crunch, anyone can turn bad. I could understand the meaning of the words themselves well enough, but I wanted to find out more of what lay behind them. Once the boy and his dog were gone, the leafy garden returned to its earlier tranquility. We remained there unmoving a while longer. Two people held fast within a silence. As we sat, the beautiful sky was slowly drained of its brightness. Over the trees around us, mostly delicate maples, dripping with soft green new leaves, darkness seemed to creep slowly. The rumble of a cart reached our ears from the distant road. I imagined some villager setting off with his load of potted plants to sell at the market. At the sound, Sensei broke off his meditation and rose abruptly to his feet, like one restored to life. You ought to be off. The days have grown a good deal longer recently, it's true, but evenings rapidly approaching while we sit here idly. His bag was covered with bits of leaf and twig from the bench. I brushed them off with both hands. Thank you. Is any resin stuck there? Everything's off now. This coat was made quite recently, so my wife will be cross if I come home with it dirty. Thank you. We set off down the gentle slope and emerged back in front of the house. A woman was sitting on the once empty veranda. She was busy winding yarn onto a spool with the help of her daughter, a girl of 15 or 16. When we arrived beside the big tub of goldfish, we bowed and apologized for our intrusion. No, not at all. The woman politely responded and thanked us for the boy's coin. We went out the gate and set off for home. After a short distance, I turned to Sensei. The thing you said earlier, I said, about how people can suddenly turn bad when it comes to the crunch. What did you mean by that? Well, nothing deep, really. I mean, it's a fact. I'm not just theorizing. Yes, that's all very well, but what do you mean by when it comes to the crunch? What sort of situation are you talking about? Sensei burst into laughter. Now that his original impulse had flagged, he seemed to have no interest in providing me with a serious explanation. Money, my friend, the most moral of men will turn bad when they see money. This reply struck me as tiresomely obvious. If Sensei was unwilling to take the conversation seriously, I too lost interest. I strode coolly onward, feigning indifference. The result was that Sensei dropped somewhat behind. Hey there, he called. Then, there you are, you see? What? I turned and waited for him. All I had to do was say what I just said and your mood changed. He was looking me in the eye. Chapter 30. I disliked Sensei just then. Even when we resumed working on together, I chose not to ask the questions I wanted, whether he sensed that or not. However, he showed no signs of being disturbed by my sulk. He strode casually on in silence, as serene as always. I resented this and found myself now wanting to say something to humiliate him. Sensei, what is it? You got a little excited earlier, didn't you? When we were sitting in the nursery garden back there, I have almost never seen you excited before. He did not reply immediately, which I interpreted to mean that I had hit my mark. But the intended bark also seemed to have somehow gone wide. I gave up and reverted to silence. Then, without warning, Sensei moved to the side of the rope. Then there, under the carefully clipped heads, he drew his kimono aside and relieved himself. I waited blankly until he was finished. Pardon me, he said, and set off walking again. I had lost all hope of getting the better of him. The road slowly grew more populous, houses now lined both sides, and we encountered no further signs of the earlier occasional sloping fields or patches of vacant land. Nevertheless, here and there on the corner of some block we saw a patch of garden with tendrils of bean vines twining up bamboo stakes, or chickens in a wire coop, which lent a certain serenity to the scene. Pack horses constantly passed us, heading home from town. Always interested in such things, I set aside the problem that had been concerning me. By the time Sensei returned to our earlier conversation, I had forgotten about it. Did I really seem so very excited back there? Well, I would not say very, but yes, a little. I don't mind you seeing me in a bad light. I don't get excited. It's true. I get excited whenever I talk about the question of property. I don't know how I seem to you, but let me tell you, I am a most vindictive man. When someone insults or harms me, I will bear the grudge for 10 years, 20 years. Sensei seemed still more agitated now. It was not his tone that startled me, however, but the meaning of his words. For all my longing to know him better, I could never have dreamed that I would hear such a confession from his lips. I had not had the slightest inkling that tenacious rancor was a part of his nature. I had believed him a weaker man. My affection for him, indeed, was rooted in what I saw his delicate, lofty nature. I had sought on a passing impulse to pierce his armor a little, but what I was now hearing made me shrink. I have been deceived by people, you see, he continued. By people what's more who were blood relatives. I will never forget it. They had seemed good folk in my father's presence, but the moment he died, they changed into unscrupulous rogues. I have borne the humiliation and harm they did to me all my life, and I imagine I'll go on nursing it until the day I die. For I won't ever be able to forget, you see, and I have still not taken my revenge. But I guess I'm doing something far more powerful than taking personal revenge. I not only hate them, I've come to hate the whole human race they typify. This is sufficient revenge for me, I think. I was silent, unable to produce so much as a word of comfort.